So to those joining us anew, welcome again to the first of Artex talks at Artex Lagos. This talk is titled, Who Will Gather Under the Baobab Tree? And will be a conversation between three fantastic speakers who I'll now introduce one by one. The first speaker is Professor Mamadou Diouf, who teaches African Studies and History at Columbia University in the School of Arts and Science. Mamadou Diouf is a Leitner Family Professor of African Studies and History. He previously served at the University of Michigan, Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, and the Sheikh Anta Diop University in Senegal. His more recent publications include the following books: The Arts of Citizenship in Africa, Spaces of Belonging, Tolerance, Democracy, and the Sufis in Senegal, Rhythms of the Afro-Atlantic, Rituals and Remembrances, and New Perspectives on Islam in Senegal, Conversion, Migration, Wealth, Power, and Femininity. Mamadou Diouf is the co-curator of a coming exhibition at the Quai Branly Museum in Paris on Senghor and the Reinvention of the Universal. And Professor Diouf was a member of the board of directors of the Social Science Research Council and the scientific board of the Réseau Français des Instituts des Études Avancées. Welcome, Professor Mamadou Diouf. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Our second speaker is Wanuri Kahiu, who is a filmmaker, speaker, and science fiction writer. Kahiu's award-winning film Rafiki was the first Kenyan film to be invited to Cannes Film Festival and has since won multiple awards across the world. Kahiu is a cultural leader for the World Economic Forum, an advocate for freedom of expression, and an Afro bubblegum activist, championing the need for the creation and curation of fun, fierce, and frivolous African art. Kahiu was set to direct Washington Black for Hulu, 20th Century Fox, and has just completed Principal Photography, an adaptation of the book by Essie Edugian. She's director of the Netflix film Look Both Ways, starring Lily Reinhardt, Luke Wilson, and Nia Long, released in August 2022, and is attached to direct Once on This Island for Disney. Kahiu was named Times 100 Next in 2019. Welcome, Wanuri.
It's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And this talk will be moderated by Wale Lawal, who is the founder of The Republic, a startup building business and creative tools for creators across Africa. He is also the editor-in-chief of The Republic's award-winning magazine, covering news, debates, and ideas on politics, culture, science, and more from a progressive Nigerian lens. Wale is a co-founder of GatePass, a digital payments and community management platform for real estate providers. He is an ex-KPMG management consultant and a graduate from the University of Oxford, where his research focused on the politics of tech startups in Nigeria, where he graduated top of his class. In 2019, Wale was selected by Quartz as one of Africa's top 30 innovators. In 2021, he was selected by Reuters as a global thought leader and by Forbes as one of Africa's 30 under 30. It's great to have you both here, Mamadou Diouf and Wanuri Kahiu. Thank you very much for joining us on this personal conversation. I think one of the motivations for having this conversation was really to consider, as we push towards a collective future, what wisdoms can we uncover, can we learn from our content and our histories, and how can we look within and internally as a precursor to moving forward into the future. So it's a real pleasure with, as a professor of African Studies.
I have to say, and please, Mamadou, please correct me if I'm wrong. I think that, I don't know if it's heightened. I mean, we have gone through colonialism, which was a big racist factor in our history. I'm not sure that there's anything that's been worse than that so far. I think that there is definitely more tension because we have social media, we have a connected universe in a way. So we're hearing more about these situations of violence, but violence against people of color, and definitely against African people, has always existed. But as a utopianist, as somebody who believes in hope and joy, I would much rather concentrate on the positive. And there has been so many positives coming out of the continent, from the artwork that is coming out, from the different artists that are beginning to be recognized, acknowledged, who are becoming people who are becoming names, household names, and being collected, to even just the ability to make space for people of color. For me, in my industry, has been really revolutionary. I know it could be a passing glance. I think it could be something that is very on trend at the moment to hire Black people. So while it lasts, I plan to take as much opportunity of the time that we have, but also to push people through. But we also know, especially just looking at the global market, how African music is being received, how African film is being received on different platforms. I think that there is now space more than ever for us to fully put our feet firmly through the door, push the door open, and make space for African voices in a way that there hasn't been before. Mamadou?
Yeah, thank you. I would like first to thank you for inviting me to this discussion, to this conversation, which is, I think, important. And I like the way, you call it that is under the Baobab, because what it shows is multiple things because of what the Baobab represents. It's a space of conversation, deliberation. It's a space of interaction, but it's also kind of mystic space, of poetic space in which people can, and what is the most important for me today, can imagine. And where Wale is talking about the African success is where we trust our imagination, where we are able to relate to the world, which is probably our inner world. And it's what explains why I think, this situation today is that Africa is going in multiple directions. Direction of success, but direction of also radical and obscene failure. And we have to try to understand today why are we going in so many directions, and how do we deal, if you want, with our own history, with our own ideologies, but also with the history we have been part of, from the Atlantic slave trade to colonization and decolonization. And one thing I believe is very important, and in many cases is the basis of the success of young African in particular, is they are relying more and more on their own commentary on the world, more than following a path which has been traced by somebody else. And I think that if we pay attention to that, if we pay attention to creating our own explanation of what the world is, we have to actually rethink what we call the global. I am very reluctant in using the term global, but the term global captures us and lock us up in a history in many cases, which is not our history, in the history of encounters. It doesn't mean, and I think it's where we also have to pay attention to, is we talk a lot about the violence of colonization, the violence of our location in the world, which is true. But as Toni Morrison says, we have also to pay attention to our reaction and resistance, to our capacity to innovate in contexts which are the context of oppression, the context of racism. And I think that is now what is happening, and we have to work on that. And being under the Baobab becomes crucial, because the deliberative moment is precisely what will make us conscious of who we are in the world and what to do in that world.
Yeah, I mean, these are very, very important, important points. And I really like I think two things. The first, Wanuri, I really like the idea or just that insistence that, we need to focus on the positives as well. But also, Mamadou, I also like this idea of maybe moving beyond thinking about, what is global, because global does really confine us into this long-running narrative or long-running history of oppression, or at least engaging with the world in extractive means in which we don't actually come out as the winners. But I wanted to also ask another question, which is, some of the debates or conversations that I've been part of recently, have also hinged on this idea that part of why we're seeing a lot of Africans, face global discrimination or face global dehumanization or any of these challenges is because of the level of development that we're facing on our continent. There seems to be this idea that the level of development that we face on our continent is directly linked to the kinds of discrimination or the kinds of challenges that we face. And so there's this idea that for us to kind of really assert ourselves globally, we all have to be richer. We all have to come from richer countries. Do you agree with this worldview, Mamadou?
I think that it's part of a much longer history, which is the history of the construction of the African and the kind of association of race and intellectual capacities and capability. It is also the way in which our inclusion in the movement of history, which is the contemporary moment we are living is associated to slavery and is also associated to colonization. So the idea of decolonizing is why the idea of decolonizing is so important, is why, again, I'm going back to Toni Morrison, the idea of building an identity by using this very complex history is important. It's not about, crying or saying or complaining, but it's about using the resources we have been able to build, both reactively and offensively, and build a presence in the world. What we are missing today is our presence in the world time, but our presence on our own term. We are still living on the representation built about us by the others.
Absolutely, and I'll come back to that. I'll actually come back to this idea of who gets to represent Africa or who gets to invent Africa. But I wanted to quickly bring in Wanuri here because of just that question or just that idea of, us presenting ourselves on our own terms. So, Wanuri, you defined yourself as an optimist, and I wanted to also just bring into discussion your really fascinating concept of Afro bubblegum, which is, this movement that seeks to promote, a more imaginative representation of Africa. I was wondering if you could tell us more about this concept, your experience with it, and why concepts like Afro bubblegum are important as we seek to, present Africa on our own terms.
Well, I think that it goes very much to what Mamadou is saying about our presence being on our own terms. I think that definitely our generation and hopefully the generations that come after are doing exactly what Mamadou is saying, is that we are redefining our own continent the way we see it, and we're redefining the world the way we see it. And I think that's really important. The role of Afro Bubblegum for me is to remind us, all of us, that we come from imagination. We come from people who have always been creative, right? We know that because our art lives in other places, in other people's museums. We come from a very rich history and culture where we have continuously been makers, shifters, shapeshifters. We have been adapters, facilitators, but in ways that that continues not to be recognized, and in ways that is not thought of as important. Our culture is important. Our culture has existed in many series of ways that are not only linked to tradition. Our joy has been ours outside of weddings, outside of circumcisions, outside of anything that we're thought of to be, as festivals or unique things. So Afro Bubblegum is not only looks into the present and says, look at us and what joyous creation is coming out of Africa, but also looks into the past and says, look at our history of imagination. Look at how a history of fantasy and fiction that pre-existed any definitions of African futurism, Afrofuturism, that pre-existed any niches that we're now being lumped into, right? In every myth, there is science fiction. In every myth, there is mythical realism. This has been part of our DNA from creation, right? I think that it's being recognized now because it's being put into a capitalist model where people can benefit and can profit from it. But our joy has always been ours first. And I think it's really important that we create with that in mind. We create with the idea that we come from a joyous past, that we don't come from a space of pain and suffering, that we shirk the idea of being a dark continent with all the connotations that has with it, but rather a bright continent, a continent that has always been full of ideas, innovation, creation, that has brought forth a lot of human civilizations and also a lot of human advancements. That is our history. And starting from there, then we can only move forward with light, with positivity, and create and chart successful ways forward. But without a beacon of light to say, look at our joyous past, look at our joyous, or what our futures could be when we create them, I think then we'll lose our way. Because if we do not have light at the end of the tunnel, then what are we traveling toward?
No, absolutely. You know, those are, I mean, I think the one thing that really struck me, the one thing that really struck me, from those points is this idea that, is this idea that, our identity is something that has existed beyond or is something that absolutely predates the categories that we're encountering today, the ways in which we're sorted, the ways in which we're labeled, the ways in which we have to kind of engage with that global system that is increasingly a capitalist system. But I wanted to bring in Mamadou to this because of this idea of us, presenting ourselves as, a bright continent, or presenting ourselves as, maybe something more than, what is typically associated with the continent. Mamadou, do you find, to me, I think this is also a conversation that ties very closely to this idea of inventing Africa and the race to invent Africa, and the fact that there are now so many different stakeholders involved in presenting the continent to the world. And I wanted to ask you, Mamadou, this idea of who gets to define Africa or who gets to invent Africa, it's a very old concept. We're talking about scholars like B.Y. Mudimbe who have written about the invention of Africa. We're talking about so many different ideas, from even just like the Victorian creation or the Victorian invention of this idea of the myth of the dark continent. But I wanted to ask you, do you find that this movement or this race to invent or define Africa is changing? Are we seeing maybe more Africans participate in this movement? And what are the ways in which we've been participating? I know that this is something that is quite a big area for you, Mamadou, in the sense in which the diaspora and those on the continent interact and engage in creating this idea of what is African or who is African. What are some of the ways that you found this dynamic to be changing?
I think that we have to accept the very idea that those multiple Africas, which are being invented, are part of a way in which, a world which is the world of Black people is being fractured. And it's also about pieces of Africa from, if you go from the ancient world, when we were talking about us as Ethiopian, this very large category of Black people, to the idea of Blackness, etc. The Arab Bilad el Sudan is the very fact that the construction of multiple libraries to make sense of what Africa is was what Africans faced very early in trying to reimagine. And I completely agree with Vanuri, to reimagine what is happening, to reimagine something different from the representation which have been produced by people who had, quote unquote, visited Africa. So the issue is not necessarily to react to what those libraries and their images of Africa, but as Vanuri was saying, is about us imagining who we are. And this is also something which is which has been part of the whole discussion about Blackness and about Africa. We have to go back to that discussion also. What does it mean being Black? What does it mean being African? And how what Ngugi Wachongo say, how could we remember the dismembered body of Africa, which is how do we go back to Blackness? And we can do it by first and foremost, and I think that, you know, I think like Vanuri is basically, are we able to create a library of Black humanities? Are we able to create a library of Black aesthetics to literally begin building a culture which is no longer the consequences of the way we are represented, but a culture which is part of our own rethinking and permanent rethinking of who we are. And, you know, one example again I will give, and again is about Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison has written a preface for a book of a Guinean writer. The book was published in 1954 and translated in English in the 1970s. It's called The Radiance of the King. And the interesting thing, what Morrison's saying is, she says that it's the greatest book ever written by an African. And Kamara Lai is usually considered in the Francophone world as a conservative writer. So it's interesting to see that. Why is he saying that? He says that this is the first time that an African takes the whole library of a European, looking at an African and turning it upside down without asking them what they think. And this is also something very important, how we authorize ourselves to do it, turning the world upside down. And this is a reaction to not only participating to this constant reinvention of Africa, but it's also about leading that reinvention, not allowing people to say some of the things they have done. And I think that, you know, in the early 20th century, Du Bois has participated in that. He has published this play, which is called Star of Ethiopia. And he is listing what he called the gift, quote unquote, of the Black man to the world, the gift to humanity. And I think that is what we have also to go back to, the way in which we have been engaging constantly what is called the human condition.
Absolutely. I mean, this definitely ties into some of the things that, you know, some of the observations that I think I've also just been making generally with, I guess, African cultures and how we're kind of being absorbed, let's say, into the global space. I'll give an example. You know, you have, I think one of the discussions that, you know, we had earlier on, just before this actual panel, was looking at something like the Grammys and how, you know, the Grammys being this authoritative voice on what gets to be acclaimed music or critical music and things like that. And then we look at sections like, world music, or now, which is now called global music. And the fact that you have a situation where you're nominating African artists into that section, but these African artists are so different. The genres are so different. You have a section that's including people like Angelique Kidjo, you have Femi Kuti, you have Burna Boy.
But I think that's something that just to pick up on that some of that conversation that Wale was starting, which is, I think that there is something very significant to be said about not only the African contribution to music globally, the roots of global music, and the source of them, the source of drum beats, I think is a really important thing to comment on at the moment, as a genesis of where a lot of music from jazz to Afro-Cuban to, well, Afro-Cuban, it's in the name, but to salsa, and where the genesis of that has also been very firmly in the continent. And even in the forced migration of Africans from the continent, the carrying of music and the way it has moved through different spaces and how it has been adapted and adopted and deconstructed and reconstructed into many things is such a glorious way of just imagining how our influence as Africans has permeated global culture. Sorry, I know, Mamadou, you don't like that word, but has permeated universal culture, in a way that is quite explosive, but in a way that is very largely ignored. So it's curious that there is a world music spot, right? Given the origins of how many origins of music is African.
I think I agree with you that it's what the word we have to appropriate and redefine is what is called world. In many cases, African influence are diluted in that concept. They disappear. Because when we say, okay, Afrobeats, it's world music, what does it mean in relation to the origin of jazz or things like that, which are also African? I think where we need as African to be part of the conversation is the discussion between, roots and what is called globalization, between the local and the universal. I think it's very important that we are part of it. And we, again, in this discussion about music, we are not deciding where we are located. It's decided somewhere else, which is also true for coffee, cocoa we are producing. The price are decided in London, not where this product. But it's also what we have to insist on, that the discussion about music is exactly the discussion which happened about plastic art in the interwar period. When actually what is called, modernism in painting in the early 20th century was so heavily influenced by Picasso going and visiting the Musée Trocadero to look at masks, which has changed radically his way of painting. And where I like Senghor, the former Senegalese president, he decided that Picasso was a Black artist. That he's part of an influence which is not only African because of the mask, but he goes beyond, saying he is from Asturias in Spain. And Asturias was part of the Muslim empire, which was funded by people who were coming from Africa, the Almoravids. So he has been living in a cultural environment which was heavily influenced by Africa. And I think that such a movement is very interesting. You capture the greatest artist and you say, okay, he's African. Like it's said that the greatest sometime artist African who had tried, in particular Nigerian, tried to pull together classical music and African music, are considered as modern artists, no longer African artists. We have to take back the qualifier.
Because there is something that is very interesting that's happening in the world now, is that there's fascination about Africa, obviously, because we're seeing it in all the art, in the art that's coming up, and in commercial art that's coming up, from Black Panther to Woman King to Black is King. That there seems to be an increased fascination with Africa, which for me is just feels like people are just coming back to their roots, which is fine. Welcome. The water is warm. We've been waiting, you know. But I think that it's something to be said about this idea of creating. So Marcus Garvey was the first one who started talking about Africa for Africans, and that for me can be very insular and very myopic, because we no longer live in fragmented spaces. We never did, right? Borders were not created by us, you know? So the fragmentation of who we are as opposed to other people no longer exists. So, but there is a space for African art and African culture, not only to be placed on a high pedestal, but to be reflective of who we are as humanity, right? But also as an indicator, as a canary about what the future could possibly be, a canary in the coal mine about what of what the future could possibly be. But also in an effort, and I know it's a very large thing to say, but also in an effort to save the world. Because our contribution can save the world. Our art can save the world. The way that we see the way that we have navigated through all the different spaces, the way that Blackness continues to be navigated in this world, it only leads to conversations of sustenance, willpower, the ability to move forward with courage and hope. Even the examples of Twitter at the moment, what's happening on Twitter at the moment, the freedom of expression that is happening on Twitter at the moment, which just leads to truly a lot of racism and slurs that is completely inappropriate. But has galvanized people to start really deciding how they want to stand their ground within the face of this, like people of color always have, you know? We won't run away from a fight because a fight is hard, because our life is full of hard fighting, you know?
So Wanuri, I have a question just based on, you know, based on that. I think for a lot of us, you know, who are either on the continent or wherever, involved either in creating or in thinking or in doing business or whatever, we're also seeing all of that. I think we're also seeing just that explosion of African like intellectual or creative contributions and all of that. But I also find that it often necessitates this type of like a kind of double consciousness, where you know that this is what you need to do to kind of get this level of attention, or maybe this is not the right kind of attention. And so it makes you kind of somewhere in between celebration and criticism. I'm wondering if this is something that you've also experienced, or Mamadou, if this is something that you've also experienced, where as part of this, you know, as we're seeing a lot more, you know, African artists or African creative people or intellectuals assert or present or reimagine what Africa is, there's often a way already in which the system works that ends up still maybe sorting them into categories that are not the intended categories. And then we find ourselves having to, at the same time, both celebrate that global exposure or that global explosion or global exposure, but at the same time be incredibly critical of it. Do you find that as well?
I don't know. I think it's an interesting duality that you're talking about. For myself, I'm still trying to understand what Africa is. You know what I mean? For myself. Because every time I travel to a new place in Africa, from Mauritius, where there are people who look completely Indian, but call themselves African, to North Africa, where people consider themselves non-Africans. You know what I mean? There's such an array of what Africa is. And every time I leave Kenya, I get confronted by Africanness, or the definition of it, because it completely perplexes me and puzzles me, right? Apart from the fact that we live on the same continent, you know? Trying to say to somebody in South America that they're exactly like somebody in North America is an absurdity. You know what I mean? So it's so varied and so large that finding a place in it in itself is hard to define. Yeah. So the duality of, but also in the same vein, being a person who is on this forum, who's using Zoom, who is able to talk to people around the world, people would claim that's un-African in itself. I have been told that my work is un-African, even though some of it is based in Africa and is about Africa. It's still considered un-African because—
I guess, yes, I get that.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because, the music is not African enough, or the humor is not what we consider Africa to be, or the concept, ideology, queerness is not what Africa is thought of. So I am constantly trying to navigate that space and what that is.
Yeah, but Wanuri, is precisely what being African is right. Being forced to navigate this multiple identity, being forced to always reinvent yourself, being forced to use it, because it's what we don't accept in many cases, to use it strategically. You know, if I compare with one, I could say, okay, we are West African. Okay, we are African. These are different ways of locating yourself in different moments. If I'm in France, being a Senegalese doesn't make a lot of sense. Being a West African, a little bit. Being a Muslim makes sense, because this is this huge group which is located differently. And I think what we have to accept is that it is an unstable concept associated to multiple expression and multiple manifestation. And in particular, African have to understand one important thing. The identity of African was not invented in Africa by Africans. It was invented by the diaspora and by anthropologists who decided to unify all of us. What we have to fight for today is, one, to claim that we are African, a project, and the second, to accept we are African in many ways.
I think that's a very, very powerful statement. And I wanted to kind of go further on that. Just this idea that the notion of being African was something invented in the diaspora. I think that this really brings in a part of the discussion that we were very eager to have as well, which is just looking at, you know, what is the function of the diaspora today? What has been the function of the diaspora? There's always a lot of conversations right now, and maybe a bit of tension as well between the diaspora and the continent in trying to define its relationship, or the relationships between one and the other. But what do you find to be, you know, the function or the role of the diaspora, or the contribution of the diaspora, I guess, beyond defining what Africa is? Because there is a sense in which, you know, people in the diaspora are also part of this really interesting project of presenting a certain type of Africa that because of, I guess, their proximity to the global sphere, or because of, you know, access to resources, maybe sometimes
enables their definition of Africa, or what they define Africa to be kind of be, the main definition. And I wonder, what do you see to be, the function of the diaspora? What do you see to be the ways in which the diaspora is representing or re-representing our lives on the continent? And that's for either you or Wanu.
Yeah. Well,
go ahead, please, Mamadou, please start.
I think the first thing we have to really underscore is that the perception of Africa within the diaspora is also multiple. Accepting or rejecting Africa has the conception, in particular in this part of the world I'm living. African had a lot of, they in many cases have appropriated the white idea of an African American. And as a result, the tension between the two groups could be important. But at the same time, you have two books which are published in 2009 and 2010. One by Ngugi wa Thiong'o on the African Renaissance. The second by Aikwe Arma, which is called Remembering the Dismembered Continent, who are claiming that the only possibility of Black liberation is to reunite Africa and its diaspora. But one thing which seems to me very interesting is the constant work in the diaspora in imagining Africa. And Wanuri has talked about all these movies which are going on. Are we able to be part in a conversation larger than that, which is a conversation which is no longer focusing on Africans and the African diaspora, but focusing on the unitary concept, which is Blackness, and trying to rethink Blackness and rethink it in a way which will allow us to move back and forth and to think of the Middle Passage not as a rupture or a turning point, but as something which has created two worlds in which people somehow keep interacting. And one of the first African-American historian, John Hope Franklin, worked about, what happened in Harlem after the invasion of Ethiopia by the Italian in 1935. And it's fascinating. He has this sentence saying, this is the moment where the most provincial American, the African American, became global. It's in relation to Africa. And these are the things we have to take over. And probably Wanuri is better, placed than me. But is it the movies enabling us or not to reopen the conversation, which existed after 1920 with the Harlem Renaissance? It was possible in 1966 when Senghor organized the Negro Festival of Art in Dakar, which was reorganized in Algiers and in Lagos. We no longer have that. We no longer have that possibility of having this conversation, which is a conversation around art, around literature, but also around economics.
And I think that's such an interesting concept, because I have always believed myself to be a Pan-Africanist, and a Pan-Africanist defined post-World War by like Caribbean historians like George Padmore, who was very interestingly was living in London, surrounded by different Black people from different parts of the world, and formed something they called the Primrose Hill Gang, because they all lived on one street in Primrose in London. And that included presidents like Jomo Kenyatta before they were presidents, Kwame Nkrumah before he was a president. And that, for me, that time is a really essential time, because it really, really investigated the idea of Blackness and Pan-Africanness, and bringing it all together in one space in multiple publications. One publication was the International African Service Bureau, that included poems of Zora Neale Hurston on the front page, and an article by W.E. Du Bois on the inside about Blackness. It was just a great time for thought and argument without cancel culture.
Yeah.
But a great time to be able to really, really dissect and really think about Pan-Africanness. And there was heated debates among them, because they had people like Marcus Garvey who was saying Africa is for Africans, and the other side saying, well, that seems to be quite racist and that it feels like segregation in itself. So coming back to that idea of a universal Blackness or a universal Pan-Africanness, with the idea, and I think that at the time that the ideology, or what their dream was, to be able to open Pan-African centers across the world in every continent, so that people had spaces where they could debate, research, talk, add to the ideas about an evolving Pan-Africanism, add to ideas about economic growth for Black people together, you know? And it's such a shame that debate and that conversation of Pan-Africanism has been diluted, has been colonized to a certain extent, because there were colonial forces actively stopping that conversation. And now is the time to start rehaving those conversations. And yes, they have started, Mamadou, in films. I think Black Panther was a very interesting, and for me, very painful conversation about the rift between Africans and African Americans. But this, and also it kicked up a conversation that I think is a very important yet hard conversation about not only reparations, but what is Africa's role in the forced migration of Africans. And how do we heal ourselves, either by is an apology owed because we sold ourselves? Is there a conversation owed to reconcile Blackness? What are the ways that we can start really, really beginning to investigate and scratch beneath the surface of not only healing the past, but to move forward as a collection of people, even in light of so much denial of roots?
I think that is a very, very important question. And it's one that we're not seeing enough of, you know, especially when we think about reconnecting with the past or how we engage with the past. I really, really like that point.
I think the anti-Pan-Africanist forces are against Wale today.
Sorry, everyone. This internet just keeps showing me. Yeah, it keeps showing me that this is something else. But no, I was saying that I really liked where the conversation was going, particularly as we look at how we reconcile Blackness and how we really talk about, you know, I guess what tends to be that big elephant in the room when we're talking about reconnecting with the past. One thing I've encountered in many conversations is this idea that let's say I'll speak broadly and say people in the diaspora, when they think about Africa, they think of us as kind of trapped in the past or as this site that is supposed to be reconnected with. But I think the drama, or what is interesting about what Wanuri posits, is this idea that, you know, there's a lot more, it's a lot more dynamic, but also this question of, you know, we sold ourselves. We kind of were also participants in this system, not necessarily equal participants, but there's something, you know, there's something to be said, or there's a contribution that we can make towards that restoration process that is often not necessarily engaged with enough. But I wanted to kind of throw a question out there because this is a conversation I've had so many different times. In some parts, some people, and to me, it's kind of summed up into these three, I guess, these three schools of thought. So on the one hand, there's people who are like, we need to do everything that we can to reconnect with our past. We need to get all our artifacts. We need to pick up all our languages. This is where like you kind of situate someone like an Ngugi wa Thiong'o with decolonizing our minds. And this idea that, the only way to properly decolonize our minds is to abandon Western languages and pick up our own languages and invest in those systems. Then you also have another school, which is kind of like somewhere in the middle, which is like, we need to, make do with what we've gotten. If it's that we speak English, we need to speak English and figure out ourselves within that, within that language. If it's that we're using Western technology, we need to figure out ourselves within Western technology. You'd situate someone like Chinua Achebe into that camp where he's talking about how, we should be, we should pay attention to the ways in which we speak English because, we tend to do, or we intend to do really incredible things with it. Or this idea of languages or Western technology just being tools that we can then use to assert ourselves or to assert our Africanness on them. And then you have also, I guess, a lesser known group, but it's a third group that is kind of just like, abandon everything, and I think there was a part earlier in this conversation where I think Mamadou was going off on something that you had mentioned about turning everything upside down. So I have a couple of friends. I have one particular friend, Sheila Chukwuloze, who does a lot of work with movement. She writes as well. And she has this idea of what she calls like the stark abstract, which is this space in which everything is uncertain. But within that uncertainty, we're able to find ourselves because there's no systems, there's no, there's no rules to follow. There's no necessarily like, you don't have to necessarily conform with Western ways. And you also don't necessarily have to conform with traditional African ways, which we've kind of lost access to. And I was wondering where you find yourselves in that kind of debate. Do you find yourselves as people who are trying to rekindle or reconnect as much as possible with Africa's past? Do you find yourself as people who are trying to combine the two, what we have access to with African past and maybe also what we have access to regarding Western, what it is that we have, that we've gotten, from the West as a result of colonization, etc. Or are you finding yourselves, in that latter group of let's clear out the room and let's start afresh, let's rebuild, let's see what, let's see what's out there that we can do when we abandon everything else?
I think it's a great question, and it's a question people have been trying to address for almost a century. And one thing which I would like to first say, I'm a historian, but I also know that history is always a narrative which is reinvented. It's something you adjust to your need. Is what we say a usable past. You need a past which serves your present and your project in the future. And when you are talking, I was thinking, about, I have been teaching a class for almost 15 years, a seminar, and the title is Pan-Africanism, a history of an idea and ideas about history. Pan-Africanism is not only this moment where people are trying to create a movement to advance their claims, but it's also a moment where they are trying to revise the way in which history is constructed. And this is an important moment. And they dealt with what you say. In 1956, you have the first conference of Black intellectuals and artists in France at the Sorbonne, this prestigious place, intellectual place. And it's Blacks coming from all over the world. And one of the important contributor in the debate is Richard Wright, the African-American writer, the most prestigious and important African-American who settled in France. And his presentation was about tradition and industrialization. And it's exactly the, the choice you are making is what he is addressing. He's saying, I don't know why this African lost elite is talking about going back to the traditions. And he is advocating that they have to break away from that tradition. They have to adopt modernity and rationality and forget their superstition. They have to industrialize, because for him, industrialization is what is actually carrying modernization. He's against religion, he's against culture. He wants just Black people to be modern. To be modern and to be secular. And Senghor's reaction is to say, okay, so if you say that, what do we do with not only the kind of legacy, which is, the legacy which has not been poisoned by colonization, but the culture we have produced in facing colonization, the way in which our traditional resources have changed. And this is what we have to accept. They are not fixed. They are not static. They have been changing. And those changes are important to understand where we are. But the second thing, which Césaire had said that, Césaire had said, okay, I write in French. I even don't write in Creole. I don't, as a politician, I have never organized a public manifestation using Creole. I have always, which is the radical distinction with Ngugi, because he didn't believe that Creole can carry what he called the kind of abstract. It's a language of immediacy. It's a language of intimacy. And it's the circles within which he's using. But he's saying, I use French, but my French is not the French of the French. I reinvent it. And by reinventing it, I'm making it my own language. And you have a playwright, an Algerian, who was unable to write in Arabic, Kateb Yassin. He has this wonderful phrase saying, French is a spoil of war. It's my language. But this is also part of who we are. We are not only our past. We have been reinventing ourselves, confronting colonization, confronting decolonization, confronting, ways in which we have been trying to build a national culture or a regional culture or a continental culture. It's not an easy choice, and it's not one or the other. And I think that, it's important to be, and for me, I insist on that, to be in a moment which is a world time. And in this world time, we have multiple resources. What we do with these resources is what is important, not thinking that you have to choose between the past, the present, or your own fiction about the future.
Absolutely. So we're going to move into the Q&A section in just a moment, but I wanted to quickly just ask Wanuri a question based off of Mamadou's points around just this idea of, we're not only our past, we've constantly been reinventing ourselves. I think the one question I want to ask you just before we move into the general Q&A section, Wanuri, is how then should we be thinking about our future? So, this is an area in which you've done work in with films and just even with writing. And I wanted to bring that back to you. So as someone who's involved in this type of thinking, how should we be thinking about our future, even just based off of this conversation that we've just had?
Oh, I can't prescribe anything other than I can only speak for myself in what I'm doing. I can't speak generally because Africans are various and diverse and multiple. But I think what Mamadou did was a really great explanation of where he's coming from, in the sense he started by saying, I am a historian. Mm-hmm. I am a storyteller. And the role of storytellers on our continent, and definitely on my side of the world, has been part historian, right? So being able to say, even a funeral singer will be able to trace back the lineage of somebody until the very first, their version of Adam and Eve. Mm-hmm. For me, it's our version of Yekoyo and Mombi. You know what I mean? So that is what a historian would do as a storyteller. They would say, this person comes from this person who came from these hills, who came from this lake, who came from, you know, so they gave us a path and a link and a route, mm-hmm. a source and an origin. But also a storyteller definitely in my region has also been a futurist. There's a huge seer from our side of the world who predicted the coming of white people before they came and called them butterflies. There's butterflies coming, right? So we have one leg in the past and one leg in the future as storytellers. We invent and we create and we give possible ideas about what we can do for ourselves, right? And within that context, the only way that I can see us moving healthily and holistically into the future is first by having more of these conversations, truly. And joining curriculums like Mamadou's, like I really just want to sit in your Pan-Africanist class. But also because I think that it is so important to have healthy conversations in a time where there is a battle for freedom of expression in a very overt way. We are so quick to self-censor ourselves because we're worried about being canceled or doing the wrong thing. That has begun to navigate how we speak, how we form ideas and thoughts above and beyond our Africanness. Our online presence is taking space above any ideology, above any nationalism, if you know what I mean, whether you believe in it or not. I think that there's spaces that we need to open up to have healthy conversations to move into a robust future, right? And trying to figure out how to link arms more with this idea of Blackness that Mamadou introduced in this conversation. This idea of us being, of finding more of a collective forum for us to redefine who we are, talk about individual identities and where we can be. But for me, the only way I can do that is by continuously telling stories of hope and joy, continuously saying, look at who we've been, look at who we are, look at who we can be in a fictional sense, just so that we're constantly reminded that we are a sum of all our parts, that we have the ability to remember, just like Mamadou was talking about and Gogo Wadiongo's ideology on remembering, but also maybe even beginning to investigate some of the things of the past that we let go of so quickly in light of religion, so quickly in light of colonization. We had our own calendars. We had a great, like the Borana calendar coming out of Turkana in East Africa was one of the oldest calendars that predates any other calendar that existed. And it was based on the rising of the moon against a particular solar system or a particular star, right? And there's so much indigenous intellect and indigenous knowledge from our side of the world that really I feel is freeing. So I don't think there's a quick answer of saying, do this or do that. I think it's actually a combination of pulling from our past and carving our future, knowing that we live in times that have completely changed, but we are adapters. And we have always adapted in every country in Africa. We have adapted technology that was never made with us in mind to suit us. So how do we continue to do that and glorify our history at the same time?
Thank you so much, Wanuri. So with that, I'm just going to open up and just take some questions that have been sent in. I'll take a couple, just depending on how much time we have. And I see already that there's some really interesting questions on here. So the first one that we have is, how do you reconcile the need to preserve our heritage and identify the need to be globally competent, especially as it relates to creating? A number of creators do create only works that resonate with Africans because of the fear of merely appropriation for others' gain. However, we also need to thrive. That is, the creators also need to thrive and be globally present and resonate with the world at large so that they are recognized and can also make money. So they want both. And how can, how does an African creator think through this? So Wanuri, I'm going to ask you this question. I think really it boils down to this question of how can creators stay critical? How can creators still stay relevant in terms of how they rely on African or maybe not relevant or authentic? How can they remain more authentic while also presenting themselves as commercially viable as well?
I think that there's great examples of people who are Wangechi Mutu. Wangechi Mutu is one of my favorite artists in the world. And her work is so rooted in who she is and where she comes from, and doesn't necessarily, I'm going to use the word panda, but I don't mean it, but as a soft panda, doesn't panda to Western ideologies of what she should be doing and what art she should be creating, and yet she's become a collector's favorite. It's, you know what I mean? So there is, I think for me, and this is a very challenging question for me as well as a creator, because not only do I work in Africa, but I also work in the Hollywood system, right? Which is its own beast, right? But I think in creating work that originates from you, as however you define yourself as an African or as a Black person, is to first ask if your work is in reaction to or as a result of your own imagination, right? For so long, we've been pegged to reaction to. And so some of the questions are posed in the context of in reaction to the West. What would happen if we took out that? What would happen if we freed ourselves from being reactionary and being actionary? Coming from ourselves, our core, and knowing that regardless of our talent, our depth, our ability will be recognized for what it is wherever we are. If you're good at something, you will be good at something regardless of where you come from, and if you work in it, if you know what I mean, you will continue to work, there is space for you. So I am curious, even for myself, because I know I fall to prey to trying to make money versus trying to make African art, right? But what would it be like if we freed ourselves from those limitations?
Thank you so much, Wanuri. I think you're absolutely right. I think, but it's also a trap that a lot of people are kind of in, and I think that's why that question is so important. How do you navigate that authenticity and that commercial viability? So thank you so much. Mamadou, I have a question for you here. So it says, Professor Diouf talked about Africans using the resources we have to build our presence in the world rather than building on the representation of Africans. I'll be keen to know his thoughts or your thoughts on how this can be achieved on both a macro level and on an individual level. So I think the question here is really, as countries or as nations, how can we, use our resources in, I guess, more ethical, in more authentic and more, and I guess in better ways, as opposed to just relying on some sort of externally imposed representation? And how can we do this both as nations or as communities, but also as people who are navigating the world as well?
I think we have to do it in at least 3 levels. The first level is a kind of global level. It's about what I was calling the idea of Blackness and a Blackness which is supported by what I was calling, Black humanities and Black aesthetic, which allows us not only to rely on our tradition, which are changing, but also to slowly create a culture in which we are absolutely able to raise questions, to address challenges, to succeed and fail. This is the macro level. This is the level of Blackness. And at the kind of national and regional levels, is about education. It is about precisely showing the tension between the way in which Africa is invented and imagined and the way in which we are trying ourselves to invent it, to reimagine it, outside of some of these constraints we have been living in, which mean that is why I have a problem with globalization, because it's imposing rules to what we have been doing. And actually is why the Pan-African, is what Wanuri was saying, is important. It's important to rethink our continent by rethinking it, find our own understanding of how do we locate ourselves and what do we have to do to locate ourselves. And of course, I think that deliberation is the first move. Being able to talk, being able to work on a vision which is shared, being able, to engage each other. And this is again where, more than anything else, imagination is important. And it's true, it's about both to be imaginative, to be part of a collective, but also individually to make money if it is possible. I think this is what we need to focus in. But in many cases, I don't think that you will make money if you are not able to be part of a collective and have a project which is a common project which has individual translations.
Absolutely, and I think that that's definitely a very, another really important question, and really, really important response as well. Let me see. I also have another question here about, I'll just quickly try and summarize this one. And I'll ask, Mamadou, I'll just continue with you and then I'll move on to, I have another question for Wanuri just right after this one. So the question here is really about the definition of African, and really just, I think about how do we embrace the phrase African, or I guess the question of, do we embrace the phrase African, or should we be looking more towards other phrases like, like Blackness? I think the actual question here is, do we embrace the phrase African as it gives us enough numbers and weight rather than just Blackness?
African is really in relation to a continent, and a space which is inhabited by people who consider themselves as African. But even the notion of being an African has always been very problematic. Because sometimes when we talk about African, we believe that all Africans are Black, let's say, which is not the case, And I think these are also important questions to deal with. But Europeans has also had this idea of what is an African, like, the white South African had decided that they will move from being Dutch to being Boers, and now they are Afrikaners, and they are African. But I prefer, from my own perspective, Black and Blackness, because I'm still thinking of the continent and the African diaspora. And why is it important? We are talking about Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is born on an idea that Africans were colonized, African American, they don't have a recognized citizenship, but they don't have a space. In the 19th century, the battle, early 20th century for nationalism was based on a population with a common culture fighting to get a territory. For Black people, they didn't have a territory. Or as they put it, their territory was their skin. So it's why Pan-Africanism was first racial. And when we talked about when actually the two main actors of Pan-Africanism of the Congress in 1945, which is Kenyatta and Nkrumah, this is the first moment where African Americans are not leading the movement. It's African with, trade unionists from Sierra Leone and Liberia. One very interesting thing is the shift from the racial domination definition of Pan-Africanism to the continental definition, which will create the organization of the African unity. So what I'm advocating now is going back to trying to reconcile those two visions and literally produce humanities which are Black humanities, where you can read Ngugi, Achebe, but you have also to read Ralph Ellison, you have to read Du Bois.
Wanuri, there's a question for you that I think is is definitely one that you should answer. So it's from a visual artist from Angola but based in South Africa, and the question is, what does it benefit artists to speak about Africa or the resources of the continent, provided that African leadership are not standing with the artists, so without the support of African leadership. The question continues, they're fighting us by saying we're exposing certain truths to the world, and as artists, we don't feel secure for our own lives. Those challenges are silencing us as artists. How can we face those challenges as artists? And of course, this is something that you've definitely had some experience in with Rafiki, and I thought maybe you could shed some light on that as well.
I think that, I lived under a dictator, right? So, meaning art was political. Goe Wadiongo was within Kenya, went into exile because of his work. He had to go into exile because of his work, because of a play, Gahikadeda, I Will Marry When I Want, right? That's what sent him into exile. He was a political prisoner because of his art. Art has always been political, especially from my side of the world. It's constantly political. Even me becoming an artist, I was called a dissident for making Rafiki because it went against what were considered the national norms and values of the country. But as artists, we define what that is. And if we stop speaking, then how are we part of the co-creation of culture? How are we part of the co-creation of history? Because history without the artist, storytelling is a form of being able to remember and forecast. If our voices are not in that, then we are depriving ourselves, our communities, our worlds of the ability to move, shape, shift, and grow. Yes, it is dangerous. I am a banned artist in my country, but I think that seeking refuge, and this is what I think is a really strong thing that you're doing as an artist, is seeking refuge within Africa, where you can continue to create African work, is really important. It's really, really important. It means that you're still part of a collective of African artists within the continent, where you can continue to contribute from within the continent on issues that are hard to tackle. But, and I know, trust, I know somebody who was threatened with arrest, who has had police people show up at my front door because of the work that I've created. I understand the complication of being able to create work that is not politically sanctioned by whatever current government is in power. But that doesn't mean we stop. We find ways of adapting. We find ways of creating under pseudonyms if we must. We find ways of moving out of the spaces that directly that can affect you. We find ways of finding safer ways to be online, offline. We find communities like Mamadou was talking about who can support you, because there is no work without a community, you know? But we don't stop working. We do not stop our courage. We do not stop our bravery, because I can name thousands of artists, including our beautiful Ugandan artist who was put in jail for writing a poem about the president's mother's vagina. You know, there has to be space to be contrary. There has to be space to be provocative. There has to be space for us to express ourselves in whichever way we choose, because that is the mark of progress. That is a human right. The ability to express ourselves is a human right that nobody should be able to take away from us, even if they're in a governmental position.
Okay, so the other question that I have for you, Wanuri, is just maybe taking us back to Pan-Africanism, and this idea that the fact that Pan-Africanism was multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual, and multi-religious, was part of its key strengths. So the question goes, Pan-Africanism, the foundation of Pan-Africanism in the 19th century was by design, or by a lot of diasporic thinkers, by also many West African thinkers or West African intellectuals, was by design, but not necessarily execution. It was multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual, multi-religious. Is this historic pluriversal model a strength that we can use today to imagine a more proactive future?
I think it would be great to have more, to find ways that we can hear, see, and experience other cultures of Blackness. Because I really, really appreciate what Mamadou is saying, is that to think of ourselves not just as products of our continent, but products of a collection of people, diverse, different, but who have great power in being able to redefine spaces and rather large, influential, and profitable spaces in the world, So I love the idea of being of Pan-Africanism or Blackness being multilingual, multicultural, multi-ethnicity, and multi-religious. I think that's the only way we can be, because as we can see in the world, capitalism is failing all of us. So if we don't begin to imagine new futures and new ideologies and use all of our hidden information in our languages and our hidden historical learnings from our past, then how can we actively create a truly positive future? So I think it's definitely important to be able to engage with all of these things, and use it as a starting, as a keystone, as a point of genesis to move into the future.
Hi, everybody. It seems like Wale has dropped off again, but we're actually more than 15 minutes over because it's been such an incredibly rich conversation. I feel like a fire has been lit in my belly. Thank you so much for a beautiful conversation. Dear Professor Diouf, many thanks to you. Wanuri, many, many, many thanks to you. And to Wale in absentia, many, many thanks to you too. And I'm sure he'll be back in a second so I can thank him again. Thank you to everyone in the audience as well that has been able to join us for such a rich and powerful conversation and for sharing such pertinent questions as well. This talk will be posted and published on YouTube on the Artex Lagos pages. So the conversation doesn't end here, and it would be great for this to continue. But thank you again for such a powerful conversation. Once again, thank you ever so much, Professor Diouf and Wanuri. My notebook that's been sitting next to me is now finished because I've just been making notes throughout. It was so enriching. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that was able to join us.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. It was excellent. And it was a great conversation.
Wonderful. Well, wishing everyone a great afternoon, evening, and the rest of the day, and see you all soon. See you for the next talk.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, you too. Bye.